Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a preview of Unris's new report, Crises of Inequality, Shifting Power for a New Eco-Social Contract. This is a hybrid event. We have a room full of invitees in New York and about 600 registrants online, so we'll see how many are able to join us in the end. Let me give my thanks initially to the Baha'i International community for hosting us today. It's a very generous offer. Thank you, Daniel. And to our speakers who are also generously giving their time. For those of you that don't know Unris very well, we are an autonomous research institute within the UN system that focuses on the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. We have 4 research programs on transformative social policy, on gender justice and development, alternative economies for transformation, and environmental and climate justice. And we also have a program based in an office in Bonn that focuses on translating research into policy and practice. Our entire research strategy is focused around reducing inequalities under the broad vision of shifting towards new ecological social contracts. Every 5 years or so, Unris publishes what it calls a flagship report. And this report aims to crystallize the work that we've done in the Institute and set it within a contemporary framing. But the report that we'll share with you today focuses on inequalities and crises, with a focus on the role of elites in development processes. So it explains how inequalities in different dimensions are drivers of crises. It explains how crises, economic, financial, political, health, environmental, play out and have impacts because of the existing pattern of inequalities. And it explains how crises tend to exacerbate further the patterns of inequalities that exist. By using the vision of new ecological social contracts or eco-social contracts, the report sets out how change in economic policy, social policy, and global cooperation can reduce both inequalities and the trajectories towards future crises. My colleague, Katja Huyo, co-author of the report with Maggie Carter, will explain this further, so I'll stop there. Now, it's easy to feel pessimistic and overwhelmed by the current state of the world. And we have to be frank, the challenges that we face are very, very significant globally, but also in our democracies, in our economies, the state of our environment. And the next 2 to 3 years at the very least are going to be terrible and life-changing for a lot of the world's people. But at the same time, we also have to keep some hope. And this report shows that there are institutions and policies that we can put in place to enhance resilience, to underpin inclusion, and to promote sustainable development, social protection systems, universal health, and education. The report says that there are changes we can make to how we incentivize and govern our economic behavior, which lies at the heart of many of the crises that we're creating, national and global, and to promote inclusive and sustainable development, and to reduce inequalities. And the report also makes a renewed case for strengthened global cooperation and multilateralism. Now, through research, Unris hopes to show that a better world is possible. And I hope you can join us today in critiquing what we've done, in adding to what we've done, in asking questions, in strengthening the work that we're doing, that we take forward into the future. Now, with that, please let me pass to Faiza Shaheen, who will be the moderator for this event. And she is the program director for the Pathfinders Grand Challenge on Inequality and Exclusion. Faiza, thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be here and to really look at this report and consider it. It's a report that really highlights how not just inequality creates crisis, but crisis is creating more inequality. We're stuck in this vicious cycle. And I think one thing that I really want to try and push us to do today is to focus on what we can do, the action we can take, which is something very central to the work we do at NYU's Pathfinders. I am going to very quickly do something a bit different, and they've done something very clever today, our colleagues, is to set up a poll. I'd really like to get a sense of who's joining us. So you will see a poll come up that asks what region you are located in, and also what sector best describes your current occupation. Those in the room, I know where you are. So we will just wait for some of those results to come through. If you want to click through, that would be great. And then straight after this, we're going to hand over to Professor Sachs. We've got an incredible list of VIPs to speak today on this issue. So I'm going to be very strict on timing so that we can hear from speakers and discuss in the room. We've got some results. Great, so we have a lot of people from Europe. Europe, Latin America, North America, of course, Africa, Asia, I mean, across the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, a really good mix of participants from different sectors. So research, academia, civil society, United Nations, international organizations, also the private sector as well. So welcome to everyone. And I hope that that mix of people, please do speak up and interested in different views as we have this discussion. With that, I am going to hand over to our first speaker, who's the internationally acclaimed, needs no introduction, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. But I would say, looking at his bio today, there was 3 paragraphs of different prizes that he's won. I thought it was really interesting that you've traveled, your work has taken you to more than 140 countries, which is very impressive. So over to you, Jeffrey Sachs, very much.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on this important work and this important report. We are indeed in a world of sharply rising inequality of income, of wealth, and of opportunity. Those are rising inequalities within our societies and across societies of the world. Many places in the world are not only being left farther and farther behind, but are, because of that, descending into conflict, environmental extreme duress, and an absolute inability to mobilize resources and governance even to meet basic needs. The challenges are very significant. The forces that we're facing are very powerful. The drivers of the increased inequality are several, but they interact, and so they're hard to pick apart individually. But I think we can say without question that we are facing underlying market forces through technological change, which tend to favor both higher skills and existing wealth levels. We're facing increasing concentration of ownership in many countries. The United States is a strong example of that. And recent studies have shown that that increasing concentration of ownership of enterprise also leads to significant declines of labor income in value added. We are facing sharp political changes as well in many societies, including the one that I know best, the United States, where money increasingly runs politics, and politics is increasingly geared towards mega wealth and higher incomes. And so for these multiple interacting reasons, technological, market structure, and political, we are in a now 40-year period of rising inequality. At the global level, the magnitude of transfers of all kinds, portfolio funding, bond markets, private capital markets, official development assistance from rich to poor countries is really a trickle. It's a little more than that. And so the role of international savings in addressing the gap between the rich and poor countries is tiny. Development assistance has really lost any kind of dynamism. This is true for the last 20 years. The level of development assistance as measured is 0.3 of 1% of the gross national income of the now very rich countries, less than half of what it was supposed to be when standards were set 50 years ago. But the quality of that development assistance has also declined because so many things are now counted in that, and so many damages are being felt by developing countries as they bend under the burdens of environmental destruction, war, massive dislocation, that even this amount of ODA plays very little role. So given all of these forces, what can we say constructively? For me, a starting point that I think is very basic but extremely important is that human capital remains the most important capital of all in the world. And that means that the path to the most basic decency, most basic needs, and ultimately to reduced inequalities is quality education for all children everywhere, and at least through the upper secondary level as called for by SDG 4. We're not even meeting that most basic standard, which was recognized as a basic human right 74 years ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Hundreds of millions of children are either completely out of school or in a context where very little learning of any sort is possible because there aren't materials, electricity, basic infrastructure, or qualified teachers. This is tragedy number one that should be addressed, in my mind, as the single highest basic standard of decency. Help children to learn, to accumulate the skills so that they have a foothold in the future of the world economy. Second, of course, is the role of fiscal policy everywhere in both rich and poor countries. The countries with the lowest levels of inequality, which are still the countries of Northern Europe, are the countries that mobilize roughly half of the national income as government revenues and then use that to ensure that all basic services and infrastructure are available to all citizens: health, education, and basic infrastructure. And we know that in most countries, fiscal revenues are nowhere near that level. And so governments, even if they have the will, don't have the means to actually provide basic services or transfer payments or pre-distribution or redistribution because the domestic revenues are inadequate. The third point within countries is ownership policy, intellectual property rights management, labor market policies that all play a role in market structure that almost everywhere have weakened the power of workers and of trade unions in recent decades and have added to the weight of technological change in shifting income distribution, both to higher incomes and to greater wealth. So all of the market structuring policies are also key. At the international level, for me, the bottom line is we need to shift a meaningful flow of global saving, which now is almost entirely taken by the high income countries and the upper middle income countries to the low income and lower middle income countries. At a minimum, and it's not even a big number, $1 trillion of the roughly $25 trillion of annual saving should shift from the rich to the bottom half of the world for investments in infrastructure, electrification, green electricity, digital access, schools, clinics, and other basic needs. $1 trillion a year won't be enough, but it's not a bad place to start. It won't happen through the private capital markets. It will happen, if it happens at all, through the multilateral development banks and the public development banks, both within the high income and the developing countries. We need a public banking approach that mobilizes a larger share of the $25 trillion of annual saving and directs it to the high priority needs of the poor and the lower middle income countries. All of this obviously faces what sometimes seems an impenetrable wall of indifference or of opposition from rich and powerful countries, starting with the United States. The US failure of leadership on these questions is, of course, startling, but I can tell you it is a failure that is as much internal to the US as it is in the United States international perspective. But we can't let the US dominate this question. We have a world of need. We have a clear urgency. Things are getting worse rapidly because of the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions regime, the tightening monetary and financial policies in the rich world, actually, and because of the intensifying environmental crises as well. So this agenda is not merely an important agenda, it is an urgent agenda. I'm going to go from this call to a call with the UN leaders in a moment on the same topic, but on how to increase that financial flow from the rich to the developing countries. I regard this as the sine qua non of what we can do at the international level. And the time is very short, and I think we have to raise our voices everywhere to say we have run out of time and the rich world can no longer duck its responsibilities. By the way, this war in Ukraine needs to end now at the negotiating table, not by defeating one side or the other, so that the world can get on with the business of saving itself from all of the deeper forces that are at play right now. So thanks again for letting me join very, very briefly, and I'll turn it back over to the moderator, and greetings to the 180 participants that are on the Zoom call. And thank you all for your leadership in fighting this battle for global justice. Thanks so much.
Huge thanks to Professor Sachs there, and I really liked this focus on the financing and the money, and I always think that there's a kind of double wealth hoarding going on. There's the rich countries, and then there's the rich within the rich countries, and how you start to unlock that in a world where, as the report looks at, we have a political system dominated by elite interests is critical to the change we want to see. So thank you to Professor Sachs for joining us and for all of the incredible leadership that he shows on this. I think now's the time to get into some of the more details after that keynote, some of the more details of the report. So I'm going to hand over to Kapia Kyo, who is the Senior Research Coordinator working on transformational research.
Yeah, thank you very much, Faisa, and good morning and welcome everybody present here in the room and also joining us remotely. And thank you also for our three distinguished panelists three eminent scholars, activists, and critical voices in the fight for social and climate justice. So it is my pleasure to preview the forthcoming Unris Flagship Report. In the report, we aim to show that inequality is not just one of the biggest challenges our global society is facing, but that inequality is also closely linked to multiple crises that affect humanity in the 21st century. Importantly, as Paul has already mentioned, the report aims to outline pathways towards potential solutions, which we frame around the call for a new eco-social contract. And I think it is a great opportunity to convene this discussion in the context of HLPF, which is focusing on building back better from COVID-19 and to reinvigorate the SDGs. On the first day of HLPF, we had passionate and urgent calls for action in this challenging context of multiple global crises. And I think also the presentation we just heard from Professor Sachs goes very much into this direction. We only have so many months and years to really work through this crisis. In the report, we promote a range of alternative approaches based on rigorous research evidence, as well as proposals from the Global South and from civil society. My presentation is in three parts. Next slide, please. The world in a state of fracture, the age of inequality, and then looking forward, a new eco-social contract, pathways towards social, economic, and environmental justice. Next slide, please. I would like to start off with the key messages of the report, very briefly. Our world is in a state of fracture, and the social contract is broken. Second, multiple crises and skyrocketing inequalities are not a flaw in the system, but a feature of it. Third, inequality is a driver, an amplifier, and a consequence of multiple crises, creating a vicious cycle. Fourth, vulnerable and marginalized groups are falling further behind, while elites often shield themselves and exploit crisis for their own gain. Fifth, to overcome these challenges, we can create pathways towards a new eco-social contract based on a vision of justice, equality, and sustainability. And sixth, looking towards how we get there, arguing for a new development model for social, economic, and climate justice. And last but not least, we urgently have to rebalance existing power structures and create new alliances for transformative change. Next slide. The next. Now let's start with the challenges and then move to the solutions. What I appreciated about the many interventions heard during HLPF so far is that there is a widespread confidence that humanity has demonstrated its ability to tackle difficult situations, and that every crisis is also an opportunity for a better future. That said, the context for achieving the SDGs has never been more daunting. We have COVID-19, which is still having very negative impacts on the world economy and on the health situation of many people. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We heard a couple of times yesterday that the number of violent conflicts is the highest since '45. And the Russia-Ukraine war is taking lives and livelihoods and affects our global political and economic relations. We see unprecedented levels of income and wealth inequalities and elite power. And finally, the multiple interconnected crises associated with neoliberal hyperglobalization have increased inequalities. They have hollowed out our social contracts. They erase past development gains and undermine SDG implementation. Next slide, please. So we are clearly at a point in time that is highly threatening for our future, but we have also learned from past experience that we can successfully address what looks like insurmountable challenges now. And research and analysis are powerful instruments in this endeavor. Let me situate now this dire scenario into a broader context of past achievements and long-term global trends. And while we do not have time today to really look more closely at long-term trends, and Professor Sachs has actually talked about a couple of them, this report argues that these trends are neither good nor bad in and of themselves and have often actually presented opportunities for economic and human progress. However, what the report argues is that many of the negative aspects associated with these trends are due to policy choices, and that costs, benefits, and risks associated, for example, with globalization or with technological progress have been very unequally distributed. Next slide, please. The report then goes on to show how inequalities and crises are interlinked, one driving the other. We argue, as in the case of the global trends, that policy choices have been crucial in driving the current crises, and in particular, the shift towards market fundamentalism in the early 1980s. As Paul already mentioned, the report analyzes 5 different types of crises: economic, care, climate, political, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And the report demonstrates how these are linked to inequalities. I will just give you some very brief insights into these interconnections. Next slide, please. So for example, if we look at economic crisis, we see that inequalities in the case of the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 have been identified as a key crisis driver. And this is not only economic and wealth inequalities, but also actually the adverse incorporation of vulnerable groups, such as racial minorities and female-headed households into credit markets. And we see here in the graph and the numbers that we have put up, the extreme instability that our age of financialization and hyperglobalization has created, and what the economic and social costs of an economic and financial crisis of the dimension of 2008 and 9 is. And the worst consequence is usually that after a couple of years, austerity responses set in that further undermine development prospects and social outcomes. Next slide, please. The gender crisis. We very much relate the care crisis to the great inequalities in unpaid care work and state retrenchment from public services. Women perform 3.2 times as much unpaid care work as men. And while there are a lot of people in the world in need of care, public care provision is lagging behind. And at the same time, the sexual division of labor at the household continues to penalize women and girls. Next slide, please. Looking at the climate crisis, again, we know that inequalities are a driver of the climate crisis, and that inequalities are increasing as a result of climate change and the other environmental crises. So for one, the richest individuals, corporations and countries are responsible for the majority of emissions, but at the same time, as these 2 graphs show, the majority of weather-related disasters, for example, are located in the global south, and also the social impacts, for example, displacement, are very much found in the global south. Now, looking at political crisis, while we might not see a complete breakdown of political order in many countries, what we do see is actually tendencies of democratic backlash, decreasing trust, conflicts, and protests. And what we see here in the graphs is just the spike of anti-government protests across all regions over the last decades. In the second graph, we see that actually over the last couple of years, we have more countries that move into an authoritarian direction than into a democratic direction. Next slide, please. And that also trust is eroding. And this is an example of Latin America, where a majority of people in a lot of countries actually think that their countries are governed according to the interests of a few powerful groups and not in the interest of the public good. Now, when we look at the economic and social costs associated with the COVID-19 crisis, again, we see that death rates, employment impacts, gender impacts, access to vaccines or economic impacts and fiscal stimulus measures are unequal. Next slide, please. Now, looking at the age of inequalities, intersecting inequalities in power. In the report, we tried to unpack inequalities And we analyzed the evolution of economic inequalities, social inequalities, and how these are underpinned by political inequalities and power asymmetries. And the report shows that economic inequalities, which have spiraled upwards during neoliberal globalization, lie at the heart of power asymmetries and elite domination. Social inequalities between groups along lines such as gender, race, ethnicity, or caste, age, disability, citizenship, or other characteristics are based on and reproduce hierarchies by applying discriminatory rules and practices. And these social inequalities often intersect with poverty and the lack of economic resources. And once social inequalities intersect with poverty, they have very negative impacts for people, for the economy, and for equity. They actually lead to very entrenched forms of social exclusion and marginalization. Next slide, please. Finally, political inequalities and power asymmetries drive and are driven by these social and economic inequalities we just outlined. Elites accumulate influence and power to preserve the status quo. And this is a very challenging context, as Jeff had also mentioned, for realizing progressive change. And it has devastating impacts often on vulnerable groups and the environment. Again, a couple of graphs that illustrate what I just said. So in this graph, for example, we can see how inequalities have increased, in particular within country inequality from the 1980s onwards. Next slide, please. And what we see now, just 2 years ago, is that by now 1% of world adults almost own 50% of global wealth. So a huge concentration of wealth at the global level and at the top level. Now, the report also gives multiple examples and case studies that intersecting inequalities create, as I said, very protracted forms of vulnerability, marginalization, and social exclusion. And we have examples from indigenous peoples and how they were sidelined in the COVID health response, of LGBTIQ+ people in the US and how they suffer disproportionately from violent victimization compared to other groups. Young workers who are twice as likely to live in poverty than adult workers. For example, 80% of people without access to electricity are living in rural areas. And it's usually also the most vulnerable people in a country that are most affected by climate-related risks. We also have 61% of the global workforce, or 2 billion workers, working in the informal sector, and they lack basic workers' rights and access to social protection. And just a final figure that shows, the huge racial and ethnic discrimination that we have seen during COVID is that death rates related to COVID-19 for Black Americans were 2.4 times higher compared to white people. Now, the report also delves into some sectoral issues such as tertiary education and labor market inequalities. But I refer you to look to the report to get greater insights on these. And I would like to move on to the political inequalities, which is one of the key concerns that we had in this report, just to not just look at the bottom of the pyramid and to describe in a way our development challenges as one of addressing poverty, which is hugely important. But we also think that we have to look at the entire range of the distribution, because the extreme concentration of wealth and income is associated with concentration of political power and specific policy choices. So when we look at the top, we see that elites accumulate money, power, and influence. And elite preferences are shaped by their perceptions about what causes poverty, whether inequality is a problem at all, and if states are effective. And we showcase quite a lot of research about elite preferences and how that feeds into policy choices. Their power resources are money, investment, business networks, lobbying, and media control. And as said before, they often shield themselves better from crisis impacts or even benefit from it. There are many examples. from the climate crisis, the COVID crisis, or the financial crisis. On the other hand, we have those at the bottom, the marginalized and vulnerable groups. Average citizens tend to be less satisfied with the system than elites, despite the fact that our political system should work for the majority interest. We also see little improvement, for example, in political participation of women. There are also issues of time poverty and a double burden that impedes certain groups such as women to invest more in political participation. Now let me move to our proposal for how to overcome these challenges. What is our proposal for a post-COVID recovery? So first of all, we present in this report a vision and principles for a new eco-social contract. And we joined actually pathfinders, with a call for changing the narrative. So only if we can get to a common understanding of where the problems come from and what the root causes are, we can also design effective solutions. Secondly, we show how to design a new development model for economic, social, and climate justice. And thirdly, we present some ideas on how we can move from vision to action through new coalitions and alliances. Next slide. So first of all, a new social contract that is fully inclusive and incorporates the environment and the interests of future generations into the equation needs to overcome the imbalances and failures of our previous social contract. Previous social contracts were characterized by exclusion of many groups, for example, unpaid and informal workers or migrants, disregard of nature, failure to finance public goods and social protection sustainably, lack of redress for structural historical exploitation and discrimination, the unequal gender contract, and erosion of solidarity and other values that are at the heart of the UN Charter. So our proposition for a vision around a new eco-social contract is based on human rights for all, progressive fiscal contracts, transformed economies and societies, a contract for nature, addressing historical injustices, promoting gender justice and solidarity. Next slide, please. Of course, this vision requires concrete policies, which we present in the form of a new development paradigm that rests on 3 pillars: alternative economic approaches, transformative social policy, and reformed and strengthened multilateralism and solidarities. I would really love to have the time to go more deeply into these propositions. It might be another event where we can really discuss the way forward. But just let me give you some keywords, of approaches that we present in the report and where we see a potential really for transformative change. And within the field of alternative economic approaches, we are discussing Green New Deal proposals, but those that are also a good deal for the Global South. Just transitions, social and solidarity economy, sustainable corporate performance measures, expanding policy space, especially for the Global South, and a new role for the state. Regarding transformative social policies, this is a field where UNRISD has done a lot of work and has actually proposed an approach of transformative social policy that it's not seeing social policy just as social protection or just as a residual instrument, but as a strong development instrument that really has an impact also on how markets function, on human capital creation, on redistribution, and on social cohesion. And these universal social policies we are suggesting need to be complemented by integrated care systems and by fair revenue policies, what we call a fair fiscal contract. It would be the previous slide, but it's okay. And domestic resource mobilization. These kind of national transformative social policies need to be complemented by global redistribution, debt reduction, and reform of the international financial architecture. Finally, the third pillar of this new development paradigm or development approach is a reformed and strengthened multilateralism and solidarities. We are aiming for reining in neoliberal hyperglobalization, empowering the global south and civil society, strengthening solidarities and values, and moving towards social contracts inspired by concepts such as buen vivir or Ubuntu that promote harmony with nature, reciprocity, and deep community ties. The report also presents, next slide please, a range of concrete policies that have proven their effectiveness in reducing multiple intersecting inequalities. And I invite you to look at the report and also the draft, the full draft report where we present these in more detail. Now, how do we get there? The question of political economy, the question of political will, the question of building alliances and joining forces. And a lot of speakers yesterday at the HLPF actually said, we know solutions, we know what needs to be done, but we're lacking the political will, we're lacking the resolve. In the report, we have a number of very positive examples where actually transformative change has happened. And sometimes it is the result of progressive leaders of newly elected governments. And sometimes it is really a combination of grassroots pressures, social movements, civil society, but also working with the international community that support these progressive forces. But I would like to end my presentation with 3 quotes actually from activists and scholars who have contributed to our report, and which I hope give you some inspiration for the tasks that lie ahead of us. So the first quote is from Kumi Naidoo. Ordinary people should be front and center in developing green climate policies. People have a range of resources and creative potential to influence the process as voters, wealth owners, consumers, citizens, and as holders of knowledge. And I think this is an empowering message that people are not powerless, but actually have a range of resources to catalyze change. The second quote is from Reema Nanavati, Executive Director of the Self-Employed Women's Association in India. And she says SEVA's experience of organizing informal sector women workers for over 5 decades in India has shown that to address the multiple challenges these workers are facing, there is a need to strengthen their collective agency, bargaining power, and leadership to help them fight against unjust working conditions and bring them voice, visibility, and validity as workers. And finally, Yayati Ghosh, where we have the pleasure to hear her intervention in a minute, says political constraints, such as corporate lobbying power, are binding only if citizens do not apply sufficient counter pressures on the governments. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of reasons for hope. We have a lot of proposals for policies that can be put into practice. And we're calling for deep transformative change and deliberations about how this new eco-social contract should look like at all levels, from local to global. And we would like to get your feedback on our proposals, on our analysis, as Paul said, your comments, your critique, what is missing. And for this purpose, we had put out the draft report I have just presented for a global consultation, and you can visit our website and leave your comments and help us to make this report better, which we aim to launch later in the fall. Thank you very much, and looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Katja, for that analysis, which was the first half was very sobering, and then great to have that sense of hope towards the end. One thing I was thinking, it's great, it's just amazing in the report how you call out those power imbalances and how central they are to why we're not seeing the change that you would expect, given the ways in which the majority are hurting, and they're hurting all around the world. But one thing that has struck us in the analysis that we've done working with countries is how much divisive narratives, the ability to pit groups against each other, is really stopping action. So it's, we have these very irresponsible leaders, let's put it that way, that are pitting groups against each other so that they are fighting each other rather than looking at the way in which the country is being governed and what elite actors at the top are doing. And I think that's something that I would love to pick up with other speakers as we go along. But thank you so much. It gives us so much to delve into. I'm going to go to our next speaker, who is Jayati Ghosh, and we had that quote there from her at the end. You again, an incredible person that needs no introduction, development economist. One thing that you might not know, we were looking at your bio as well this morning, is that as well as being this incredible economist and thinker, Jayati Ghosh is also has an active interest in Western classical music and is also the vice president of Delhi Music Society. So there you go. All right, handing over to you, Jayati. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Father. And it's such a pleasure to be with friends at Unris for this very important report. And I'm so glad that this report has actually told it like it is. You haven't pulled any punches and you have isolated the problem. In other words, a lot of reports talk about inequality and how it's going up and the implications and how the crises have added to it, but they do not situate inequality as the cause. And I'm really happy that Unris has put it out there, that in fact, it's not just a result. It is fundamentally causing the insecurities, the crises, the instabilities, the dysfunctionality that we see in our economies. And I think what's also important, you don't say this quite as openly, but I think it's implicit throughout your report, is that in a sense, what's the cause of inequality? It is actually it's the result of state action at both national and international levels. In other words, inequality isn't just happening by accident. It is a circular process whereby rising inequality generates particular political power, which creates regulatory and other policy changes that benefit the rich and the elites, which leads to more inequality. And that is the critical chain that we have to break. So you have identified this, I think, in a very clear way, which a lot of other reports on inequality skirt around. And I think that's crucial. That's so important. So if you like, the only thing I would add, you have a lovely slide on the global trends and you've highlighted those. I think a very important global trend of the last 3 decades particularly is regulatory capture. It's state capture by large corporations and the elites. And it's really that which is driving, we kind of say, well, this has happened, that, large corporations are getting bigger and bigger, or that, there is more power of particular types of capital versus labor and so on. These are not accidental. These are the results of policies and of regulatory changes that have changed what is now being called pre-distribution, and which cannot then be undone by attempts at redistribution. Because then they have the power not just to change the regulations which enable much greater profit taking, but also that prevent adequate taxation, for example. This regulatory capture has got to the point where it's actually creating completely dysfunctional economies. In other words, we now have a global capitalism which is frankly dysfunctional, at many different levels. But let me just give you a few examples of how this regulatory capture works. Austerity, right? We all know about fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity, because of crisis, because of states not having resources, because of pandemic, because of famine, because of Ukraine war, whatever. But they're also typically accompanied by reductions in direct taxes on corporations. So bear this in mind. It's fiscal austerity for some, and in fact, state largesse for others at the same time. The whole issue of knowledge governance, the fact that intellectual property rights grant monopoly power to companies, and they get these benefits even when all of the innovations or the R&D, etc., are publicly funded. I mean, the COVID-19 vaccine is a classic example of what has just happened, which is that these are all vaccines that are publicly funded. In most cases, the mRNA, for example, 90% of the work was actually done in public labs and research institutes. Subsequently, you get a little bit of additional money, but that is all through state subsidies. And yet these are private corporations that are then allowed to keep the patents. prevent others from producing, prevent the dissemination of this knowledge and technology, and keep reaping monopoly profits. We have the example of the current inflation, which is creating major food crisis in many parts of the developing world. And everyone says, oh, it's the Ukraine war, it's the supply shortages, it's the constraints because of COVID and so on. Yes, some of it is, maybe about 1/3 of it. But a very significant part is profiteering. Profit inflation is driving the current food and fuel inflation. It is not just cost. It's not just supply shortages because of the Ukraine war. That explains less than half. Most of it is profiteering and financial speculation in the commodities markets, which is driving up these prices. So yet there is no attempt to regulate those. Okay, let's think of the financial sector and the fact that financial deregulation, the proliferation of new kinds of instruments and innovations which are extremely risky, create bubbles, create instability, cause higher and higher costs in terms of fees and commissions and so on for ordinary consumers, are all allowed. And irresponsible behavior continues to be allowed after all the lessons of the global financial crisis. And bailouts continue to be provided for finance, but they don't continue to be provided for sovereigns in developing countries, poor sovereigns who are battered by processes that are no fault of their own. They are not provided for ordinary people who are, let's say, homeowners or who have taken on debt for essential reasons like children's education, health reasons, food consumption, and so on. We have, in environment terms, a big discussion on carbon tax. Everyone says you've got to get the prices right. Okay, so what do? You put a carbon tax, a border carbon tax, which will disproportionately affect poor exporting countries, or a domestic carbon tax, which will disproportionately affect the poor. Nobody mentions the subsidies, which the IMF has estimated today are $5.9 trillion in fossil fuels. Why are we not talking about eliminating these subsidies, which are going directly to large oil companies? So many ways in which regulatory capture is driving inequality. These are just a few examples. I could give you thousands more, and there are, I'm sure, plenty more in the report. Now, what does this mean? It means that to change this, we definitely need a social contract, but we need to actually change the nature of this regulatory capture. In other words, we have to change these regulations, we have to change these policies, we have to change the fiscal approach, we have to change the monetary approach that offers money to large banks but does not underwrite household mortgages, for example. So ultimately, I think the outline that this report has provided is excellent. It gives you the essence of what needs to be done in a very broad brush stroke. But it really boils down to reversing many of these strategies, these decades of deadly privatization, of the privatization of basic services, of finance, of knowledge, of the commons in general. And this in turn means that we necessarily require massive increases in public investment. One of the aspects of inequality, which is also very important, which has been highlighted by the World Inequality Report produced by Lucas Chancel, Piketty, and others, is that it's not just within groups of individuals and households, it's also between the public and the private. Public wealth everywhere, public assets have declined, and in some cases there are even negative now in many countries, whereas private wealth has exploded and got more and more concentrated. That's bad news for all of us, because when the public loses its wealth, it has less ability to fund the basic services that we see as essential. We need to bring back public wealth. It's critical, it's important. Yes, an accountable state, but an accountable state that has the wealth, the assets, and the ability to provide the resources and the services and the basic amenities that should be everyone's human right. So we need to actually get rid of the policies and changes that, by the way, are not that old. They're really 3-4 decades old at most. We need to reverse those changes. And that, yes, needs a social contract, but I think it also just needs awareness. I'm so happy that Unris is doing this report, because, finally, that kind of awareness is still missing. Ordinary people, even in developed countries, don't really understand the extent to which their governments, whom they go out and vote for and so on, their governments are essentially doing policies that enable and enrich a very, very small elite. Tax policies, the absence of minimal tax cooperation that would make corporations pay the fair share that all domestic companies pay. But multinational corporations don't pay because they can move profits around to different low tax jurisdictions. That attempt, which it seems so obvious, it's low-hanging fruit, failed. Why? Because multinational corporations lobbied and got their governments to water down the proposals. But ordinary people are not aware of this. They don't even know that all these discussions are going on and these negotiations have this implication. So I think awareness is a critical part. It's, if you like, the first step in mass mobilization, which is why this report is part of, I think, a very important broader effort to make sure people understand what's going on. We are not going to get change unless we have massive public pressure, as I've mentioned, as you very kindly quoted. But we're not going to get that public pressure unless more people know. And I don't think enough people know, certainly not in my country, India, not in large parts of the emerging, developing, whatever you want to call it, world, low and middle income countries, and not in the rich countries either. We do not know the extent of regulatory capture. We do not know how much regulations and policies have changed over the last 4 decades, which have created that huge increase in inequality. And we don't even realize how easy it is to change these. It is easy. It can be done. It really just requires political will of the states, but that means also political will of all of us to go out there, to spread that word, to create that message. So I'm really happy that Unris is part of spreading that message. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that really passionate reminder of the injustice of state capture that is happening in various different ways all around the world. I really like that point about awareness raising. I think we actually have come a long way on the conversation on inequality, but we still have a lot of work to do to get people really not just aware of this issue, but also believing that something can be done about it. Those of us that have been political actors and knocked on the doors of everyday people and tried to have these conversations, they do understand that there's these huge injustices, that there are these huge inequalities, but they don't believe that anything can be done or anyone's on their side to do something about it. And so it's both those things that we need to work on. I can see lots of questions coming in. I really want to be able to get to them. So let me just introduce our last speaker, who is Lisa John, who is the Secretary General of Civicus, which is a global alliance dedicated to strengthening citizen action and civil society around the world. So I feel like this conversation has perfectly been teed up for you to tell us how we can build social movements around the world to address this. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Faiza. I have bad throat this week, so I'm just going to ask people to bear with me as I speak, but I have a lot to say, and I've been very excited to read the report, and especially the section on the new eco-social contract. So firstly, I think, just the reminder that you all have made in the report that the COVID pandemic was actually the great revealer of inherent flaws in all of our fundamental systems. I think that's really well said and well framed. And the fact that there's been a complete over-reliance on market mechanisms to address all of our social and economic problems, which, I think people are quite disillusioned with right now. I actually wanted to talk about the 7 principles that you all have outlined in your report in relation to the new eco-social contract, and at least 4 of them, human rights for all, addressing historic injustices, achieving gender justice, and the whole idea of increased solidarity and enhanced multilateralism is absolutely dependent on better opportunities, mechanisms, and infrastructure for civic engagement. So for me, it's really not just a crisis of economic, financial, and social systems. It's really a crisis of civic freedoms, of democracy, of how we're actually enabling the drivers that will actually see the change, to grow and to manifest and to engage. And just last week, we released our 2022 edition of the State of Civil Society report. We have an annual report where we track trends in civil society. And it's interesting that many of those findings actually correspond with a lot of, the kind of the summary that Katja provided at the beginning of this session. So I'm just going to touch on the intersections, because I think it's interesting just to look at those trends together. So one, for sure, a complete dismantling of functioning and effective governance systems and frameworks. And there are 4 key ways in which that's happening. The re-emergence of military coups, and that's not happening by accident. The entire COVID period has been used. I mean, emergency laws, disproportionate emergency laws have been introduced in almost every country, deliberately to kind of restrain civil society, to restrain citizen action, and to kind of really remove the checks and balances for democratic engagement, even in terms of passing laws and regulations that even parliaments are not aware of. So I think that's been deliberately used to then step up, the control of the army. So in at least 8 countries, which includes Burkina Faso, includes Sudan, you know what's happening in Tunisia already, and also what's happening in Nicaragua. So this has all kind of been, a process towards really ensuring that there's a complete fall or failure of the democratic process. So that's one trend that's emerged in the last 1 year very clearly. The second is the normalizing of racist and divisive and xenophobic discourse in elections. And of course, we saw that at the grand scale, especially in the US and India, for instance, but it's also happening in the last few months. We've seen that happening in France, Portugal, and Hungary as well. So again, using a lot of, the tensions, the fears, the uncertainties linked to, rising prices, the attacks on livelihood, things falling apart for people in their day-to-day lives as an opportunity to dismantle governance. Then really the emergence of rogue states, and I'm saying this very deliberately because what we're seeing even with the Russia-Ukraine conflict really is lots of countries basically just disregarding the international system completely and saying that we're just going to do it our way. And then countries either abstaining from objecting to it, including South Africa, where I am from now. I live now, or countries like India, where I originally am from. So you're kind of just seeing a complete disregard for all of the frameworks and systems that have held the world together, right, across all these years. And it's interesting that the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually next year. And we're at a state where, it's almost a complete disarray, and the UN system as a whole has really been, kind of reduced to a kind of bureaucracy, both by the cost cutting measures, but also by just completely rejecting the moral authority even that the UN system has in such situations. And the fourth kind of real red flag for governance is what Dr. Ghosh mentioned earlier. It's really the rise of ultra capitalism and the rise of the disinformation economy. So the fact that the nexus between the political elites and the economic elites is so visible and so stark and so overwhelming across countries that then the weakening of all of those processes for civic engagement just feeds into that concept of absolute power, right? And the fact that there's really very little that can be done to then change and override the way decisions are being made, resources are being diverted or taken away, and the way that populations are then being forcefully controlled. So it's no surprise then, I mean, many of you might have already heard of the Civicus Monitor, where we track the status of civic freedoms across the world. So as of this year, it's only 3% of the world's population that actually lives in countries where civic freedoms can be openly expressed. So the right, to the freedom of expression, the freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. It's just a very small, proportion of the world's population that can actually live their lives in a way that they can freely do that. 44% of the world's population actually lives in contexts where their civic freedoms are repressed. So there are significant challenges to actually exercising any of those 3 fundamental freedoms. And a full 1/4 of the world's population, so 1 in 4 people, live in contexts where you can be attacked, arrested, or killed for simply expressing dissent or organizing or trying to engage with any kind of public process. So I think we're really, in a place where if we really want to achieve the ideals of all of these reforms in different systems, we can't do it without actually addressing the space that is needed and the infrastructure and the support that is needed for civic engagement and civic participation. The other two trends that I just want to talk about is, again, the specific targeting of women and traditionally excluded groups, and this links to the principle of, addressing historic injustice and achieving gender justice. So, just the scenario and the landscape for abortion rights going, completely beyond imagination in the US and Poland, for instance. The kind of repression you're seeing against women in Afghanistan, but also in countries like India, where Muslim women in particular are at the crosshairs of that, kind of political, propaganda against religious minorities. And I think that's where, at every stage, I think what we found is that there is a huge lead up, right, before you get to the stage where everything falls apart. And international institutions are not, and regional institutions don't act fast enough when those red flags emerge. It's actually local populations who are actually organizing much more actively and much more quickly to respond to these changes. So the good news, at least at the end of the day, is that although we will be seeing many more challenges, and in the slide, Kadra, you talked about civilian protests. That's just going to exponentially increase in the next few months because of the food price increases that we're all experiencing across the world. There have been significant wins in at least 15 countries in the last year, one year alone, on a lot of these important rights. So I'm just going to talk through a few of them very quickly. One is in relation to elections. I think voter mobilization is, in terms of progressive politics, is showing visible results, and people are organizing on the ground, are realizing that they really need to change the narrative. They need to be active in how they influence democracy and democratic processes. So of course, the US elections, was a sign of that a little earlier in this period. But just in the last year alone, there have been at least 5 countries where voters have deliberately voted for more, inclusive, more equitable policies and governments, and this includes, Slovenia, it includes Australia, it includes Chile and Honduras. Then you have actually progressive wins on abortion rights, again in another 4 countries, including Mexico, Ecuador, and Colombia. And then on LGBT rights, even though there's been a pushback in so many contexts, there's again another 4 countries where you've had people pushing policymakers to take progressive action, including Jamaica, Honduras, the referendum in Switzerland and in Chile as well. So finally, I think on climate action, I think you're seeing a really new arena of shareholder activism and voter activism work together to really make that front and center of both political outcomes in terms of elections, but also in terms of either judicial action or the action that businesses need to take. And the 2021 judgment in the Netherlands, for instance, against Shell is an example of that. So I think what we're seeing is there's a massive opening of new frontiers for civic action, for citizen organizing, which is not now dependent on the shepherding that we used to see by big international or national organizations. It's very much about people being aware of what's important, people kind of aligning with the values and the long-term transformations that we've been talking about for decades. And I think that's the ray of hope, that the language of justice, the language of change, the language of transformation is household. Is household language right now, and it may not feel like that in every place we sit in. Depending on where we live, but that is something that's happening, and that is something that's overturning and threatening, regimes that are trying to hold on to power and control power. And I think the big shift, especially because this is an UNRISD conference, is that international institutions are not following that trend. So the fact that you have a COP, event this year in Egypt, which is completely closed for civic any form of civic organizing. It's basically you're already sending out a message to people that this is just going to be, another talk show. And I think people are just way smarter now and way less intimidated by traditional leadership and traditional institutions to buy into that kind of formal staging of dialogues, right? And so if the real dialogue is not going to happen in the spaces where they should be, they're definitely going to happen on the streets. And I think that's what we really need to be aware of and build on.
Many thanks for that, Lisa. And it's, there's a lot of hope in that, that people are starting to fight back, and rightly so. We have a number of questions and not a lot of time left. What I will do, and unfortunately Jayati Ghosh had to leave, but we have the report author here, so Lisa, John. So I'm going to take a round of questions and then go back to them. You've got some questions from online. Or do you want to read out 3 of them? And then I'll also take a couple of questions from if there's anything that are great.
Yeah, there are some questions that, we've got lots of questions. So first of all, thanks very much for really active engagement. They overlap in several areas, and then some of them are very, very specific. But I've picked out, I think, an important question for Katja, at least initially, which is, could you explain perhaps in a bit more detail what fairer fiscal contracts are and how they can address social inequality? And the context in which the question asker asked the question is, sometimes countries have to have lower tax rates to attract good companies. So how does that all work out here? So a question around fairer fiscal contracts. There were lots of questions around the narrative and how you convince people, including elites, that fairer worlds are also in their own best interest. And I don't know whether you might also want to reflect on that, Katja, and Lisa, you might want to reflect on that. How can you actually break that stranglehold on the narrative? How can you convince people of the problem statement? How can you get people to mobilize? I know you touched a bit on that already, Lisa, but I think now concretely, how can we do that?
Great, there's a couple of questions here. Okay, let me take these 3 then, and do introduce who you are.
Hi, thanks. I'm Katie Tobin with WeDo, the Women's Environment and Development Organization. Really appreciate the intro to the report and the work that went into it. I think there's a lot of exciting kind of related work that's happening. Greenpeace has their Alternative Futures project. Christian Aid is also working on a new social contract. WeDo is part of a new feminist action nexus on economic and climate justice, which takes a very similar kind of systems change structural approach. But it's kind of similar to the second question that Paul mentioned in terms of how we actually start to build alliances and constituency for these approaches, especially when, at least so far, what we've seen in the HLPF, I don't think is kind of raising the kind of space for questioning the very foundations on which these systems operate. I didn't hear it yesterday. We'll see what happens over the next couple of weeks. Is the UN really the space to have this conversation? I'd be interested to hear what Unris thinks of that, and any other suggestions that you have and that Lisa has. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Bodo Elmers from Global Policy Forum. I'm also a member of the Reflection Group on Sustainable Development. Well, thank you very much for giving us the preview of the report and the chance to comment on it. I have 2 points. The first thing is, you demand international financial architecture reform, but at least the PV stops short of basically discussing the proposals we currently have on the table. For instance, there's currently a big discussion on introducing a UN tax convention to address the topic that was mentioned, harmful tax competition. The debt crisis has also been mentioned several times as a problem. So there's a discussion about how to create effective institutions for sovereign debt workouts. So my question would be how to put this in the report. And the second is basically on the elephant in the room, the question of geopolitical tensions and how they impact. Obviously, we have a situation. I think it's not necessarily bad. As we've all seen during the Cold War, the inequality has been much lower than it is today. And we've also seen as an outcome of the G7 summit recently that the G7 offered a huge infrastructure financing package to the global south. That is not necessarily new money. There's new money coming, but there's not an increasing competition basically to care for the third world in the times of geopolitical tensions. On the other hand, of course, we are also increasing military spending, including in countries governed by the left. We just received news from Spain, from Germany. So how does this impact on your idea of the eco-social contract?
Great, a lot in there. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Manisha Sun, Professor of Sociology at the University of Connecticut, and also an Unris Fellow. And I guess mine is similar to yours in the second question that Paul read from the, I guess, online questions, which is changing the narrative. And I think fundamentally not, I mean, on one hand, you have to be optimistic so you don't sort of see the contradictions in terms of what JP said about raising awareness or what even Jeffrey Sachs mentioned about human capital, but in some ways thinking about human as capital is also, for me, a fundamentally flawed articulation, because that only leads you in certain ways of how we're going to mobilize that. But I think fundamentally awareness is not lacking. People do know, and being situated in the US, think about the overturning of Roe, there are women on that side. So even among the marginalized, there are a lot of differences, and people have bought into certain kinds of value systems. And so it's not just changing the narrative, but fundamentally changing how we think about our relationships to others. And so it's not only the elite who are interested in keeping the power. So if you see people on both sides of the road decision, there are lots of women, there are lots of marginalized people on either side, and it's not just Roe, it's gun control. I mean, so these are very local levels. So if this, I forgot the name of our colleague from Civicus who said people on the streets are actually bringing in progressive government in some cases yet, but in Philippines you have Ferdinand Marcos, a son point, right? And people on the streets want a lot of different things because they've bought into the narrative as well. Yeah. So it's, building solidarities even on the streets is not that easy. And I think if you don't recognize those contradictions, then I think strategies we will have will be having the same conversations.
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding us of those complexities that, of course, people have been socialized in this world. And so they have also adopted these narratives and adopted the way the world is, even though it makes them worse off. So there is a kind of polarization in the response. There's more protest in the world, but there's also more protest from places that we don't want to necessarily see it. So let me go to you first, Lisa, if you want to come back. There's a lot there on narratives, movement building, and then I'll come to you, Katya.
Yeah, I think the thing is that it's longer our mandate business. It's been changed.
No, you're cutting out a little bit, Lisa. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Let me off my video and see if that's. Can you hear me better now?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think that the part about the narrative is that we also launched a review of 10 years of civic space trends last year. And the biggest question that we kept getting asked was whether protests actually make a difference. And you only read the stories of protests having created disruption and then things having gone back to where they were before the protests happened, right? If you still can't hear me, just raise your hand because I won't know if you can, but I'm assuming you can. Okay, great. So I think what we found is that protests have been the single most effective way to change narratives at scale. Look at Black Lives Matter, look at the Indian farmers protest, look at the climate action strikes, look at the Me Too movement. There's no other means, whether you invest 20 years of civic education, you rewrite history books, you do whatever you want. There's no other more effective action in terms of really, forcing society to question certain very strongly held assumptions or beliefs than mass protests. And that is simply the most important reason why attacks on freedom of peaceful assembly have been the #1 civic freedom violation during the COVID period. And I think governments realize that the power of just people mobilizing, and they're not mobilizing out of leisure, they're mobilizing out of anguish, desperation, anger, and agony, because there is no other alternative. So the trust in institutions, like Katya mentioned in the beginning, is at an all-time low. People are just not interested in other organizations coming in and telling them what needs to be done. They're just going to do it themselves. But I think the difference is depending on where you sit and what media you absorb your information from, you're going to get a very different story of how change is happening based on what propaganda you receive. And I'm again using propaganda very deliberately because most of the mass media we receive is controlled by business. It's controlled by political elites. And then the information that you get about change happening on the ground is usually only through organic sources. I think the good news is that the largest number of young people ever, taking to the streets maybe after the 1970s is happening today. More people, the first form of democratic action for more people under the age of 18 now is a street protest, even before they have the right to vote. So there is like an incredibly, high level of awareness of your rights as a citizen and your ability to influence policies. And we will always get the bad news in the headlines. We will always be told that it's not working, that these are disruptors. But the fact that even traditional or long-standing democracies like UK and Spain and others have now started, have talked about changing laws, are bringing in policing bills, means that something is working. I mean, it's a bad move, but it's a move based on fear. It's a reaction to losing control. And I think that's where governments are getting it completely wrong, because they're still working off a script that belongs to the last century, and they're not realizing that every single person who owns a phone is a potential activist. There is no way you can roll that back. We get requests on a daily basis, civic, freedom or human rights defenders, even in the most restricted context, where nothing is possible, where you can be killed for simply criticizing the government. People are still protesting. People are still doing things to reclaim their democratic rights. So it's like that saying that, you don't teach people to build a ship, you create the yearning for the sea. The yearning for democracy is across the world. The explosion of information, the explosion of technology has created back. Nobody in the world, including the most powerful government, can roll that back. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the Hong Kong protests, right? So I think even though we keep getting the bad news about protests not working, that's deliberate misinformation, and that's not what's happening on the ground.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for that. And I think it's true that sometimes, because they want people to feel powerless, they don't tell the positive stories, and we only hear the negative ones. And I really like that saying about not teaching people to build the boat, but instead yearning for the sea. Okay, Katya, do you want to come in? There were some questions there about the fair fiscal contract and other issues. And then I was thinking, if we could bring you in on some of the UN, what's happening in the multilateralism. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for these very interesting questions. And I just wanted to mention with regard to what Lisa just said on the protests, and that a lot of people actually think they're mostly disruptive and not so constructive. I wanted to point to a book that actually Sarah Bokeh, who is here in person in our meeting together with Isabel Ortiz, have published very recently, and that actually shows that a lot of protests, and I have this number in mind, that around 40% of protests staged against inequality issues have actually led to tangible policy reforms. And one of my favorite examples, of course, is the estallido social, the social outburst in Chile, which started many years ago and has actually led to a new government, a new constitution, and actually a new eco-social contract in the making, and now up for vote, actually, with the electorate. On the fair fiscal contract, what we have tried to emphasize in UNRISD for many years is that if we want transformative social policies, and if we want to deliver on social rights and social services and the necessary social infrastructure, we have to underpin this with sound financing instruments and sufficient resource mobilization to actually put this into practice. And I think Jeff has also mentioned that in his speech today. There is the will, but there are no means. So we really have to combine political will with fiscal resources, and a fair fiscal contract consists in a way of social spending policies that are socially just and that provide universal rights, social rights, but also support through affirmative action those that have suffered from historical injustice and are left behind. But on the financing side, we very much have to institutionalize fair tax policies, and innovative, financing instruments that also support the sustainability transition. So we actually have quite an ambitious program regarding financing, because on the one hand, we have to shift the tax system, to more progressivity. On the other hand, we have to make our financing system more environmentally sustainable. And a fair financing system, for example, that places a greater burden of contributions on high income groups, on corporations, on large corporations, on those that have ability to pay, is also a system that actually takes into account the needs of social groups, such as women or informal workers or minorities. And we have seen, for example, that a lot of the tax reforms that are proposed, for example, expansion of value-added tax, that definitely has regressive distributional impacts for women, for informal workers, and for other groups. And so it increases social inequality as well as economic inequalities. Regarding the race to the bottom, this just speaks, to the need for multilateralism and global governance on these tax issues as well. And I think there are some proposals in the making, and there are some steps. But tax policy is not something that can be entirely done at a national level. So it requires a very strong global governance regime that actually minimizes tax evasion, illicit financial flows, and also establishes some innovative new taxes we are talking about for a long while. So linking this with your question on the international financial architecture, of course, this is not a new issue. We have been proposing reforms of the international financial system and the architecture for many years, and that really includes all the points that you have mentioned: the debt architecture, the multilateral financial institutions, the way liquidity is channeled into low-income countries, how capital markets are regulated, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot on the table, and we discussed quite a lot of these proposals in the report in more detail.
A bit short on time. Sorry. Do you want to?
Yes. So yeah, I think just maybe on the narrative and how we can push progressive change. I think awareness is very important, and we have actually some interesting research that also shows that people are often not entirely clear about the consequences that certain policy proposals have, in terms of distribution and how it affects, their own incomes. And there is research that shows if you present a policy proposal and you also tell people about the distributional consequences, so who gains and who loses, and what does it mean for the richest in your society, and what does it mean for the middle classes, the lower classes, they actually change their voting behavior. They change their opinions about whether this is a good or a bad policy. So there is a point in awareness raising. But I think in terms of how to bring in elites, into this strategy for change, I guess, what we try to do with this report is to show that inequalities are drivers for crises, and crises affect everyone. So the crisis that we have described, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate, whether it's political crisis, whether it's economic crisis or the care crisis, this also affects high income groups and elites. So if they understand that actually, inequalities are not drivers of economic growth, but rather undermining economic growth and creating a huge amount of instability, I think we can also get more buy-in from the elites, to address these inequalities, so we can actually create more resilient, stable, and prosperous societies for all.
Thank you so much for that, Katja. Did you want to come in with any last words and thoughts on the multilateralism?
Very, very briefly, because I think an hour and a half is enough for most people on this topic. But yeah. So before I do so, let me just say thank you to everybody who's engaged in the room. the presenters, the discussants, those who've joined us online, and for also the questions that they contributed. Clearly, the world is in a state of fracture at the global level, and there's been a dissipation of trust within the last 20 years that was exacerbated by the global economic and financial crisis as well. I think UNRISD is a sort of a strange bit of the UN. Independent, doesn't take funding from the main UN system, doesn't have member states on its board, tries to do an honest job providing solid research to contribute across all of the pillars of the UN, particularly on development, of course, but also on human rights and also with implications for security. And, you know, we do that to the best of our ability, but as a small entity, there's only so much reach we can have. If you look at the competitive nature of global cooperation at the moment, I think there are risks in it as well. But unfortunately, you've seen the G7 re-announcing their package on infrastructure at the last meeting, having not done anything in the year before to compete with a Belt and Road initiative driven by China, which has been investing for 15 years in infrastructure in many countries, which has also contributed to their severe debt situations that are going to unravel in the next 2 to 3 years. So I think it is essentially also a question of power imbalances between more powerful countries and less powerful countries. China actually, as a competitor in that multilateral system, is now a key part of that and potentially a problem for many countries as well. The debate at the UN is difficult, but it's still better than having the debate in a smaller plurilateral setting, such as the OECD on tax matters or the G20 on all of these issues, because the risk of further cleavages which alienate and exclude poorer countries with less voice is still very clearly there. So the UN, with all of its problems, still has to maintain some centrality in this debate, and we have to work through it. I mean, the most recent process that I saw actually build trust was the SDG process, because they did it for 3 or 4 years. They were in the room together, they were talking. I think one of my colleagues called it the biggest training for diplomats on sustainable development. They had a shared vision of the things that they need to do. Whether we have that amount of time to talk through the current challenges or not, I don't know, but I wouldn't lose the UN in that picture.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that's joined us online and in the room. I think you'll agree it's been an incredibly rich discussion of what needs to happen, not just the problem, but what needs to happen going forward. And to congratulate Unris again and our colleagues Katya and Maggie, thank you so much for organising this as well, and to Paul. And just to say also, keep in touch with us at Pathfinders. We're doing some more work on narratives, and we're bringing together a global workshop on this. So it's coming up everywhere. It's really interesting. Every meeting I go to recently, they end up talking about narratives in every country we've been visiting. This is my colleague Paula. You know, countries are really struggling with this, how to make the argument. And unfortunately, too often we're seeing progressive governments lose the argument. So yes, thank you so much. I think one thing that I keep thinking is that we have power, I have power. What are we doing with the power that we have? And if we can walk away today and think about whatever that may be, if it's raising awareness, if it's helping to build social movements, if it's shaping policy, that we use that power in this moment, because if not now, then we're going to miss the opportunity. Thank you so much. Thank you again.